Story 1. Pong, mid-1970s. Although that was on a television. The first game played on a computer was probably Adventure, also known as Colossal Cave Adventure, played on a mainframe terminal around 1980. Story 2. I believe it was the Day of the Tentacle, but I think I watched more than played. After that, I believe it was Body Blow. There was also a game called Funny Face where you could assemble faces using parts like eyes and noses. Story 3. Space War on Disk Operating System. It was a two-player game meant to be played on the same keyboard. The game featured fairly advanced physics for the time, although that made it more frustrating to play. Story 4. I forget the name of it, but it was a game where you are the doctor and have to perform surgery on patients. Showing my age, I played it in the early 1990s. Story 5. Dig Dug, I believe, was the first game I played on my friend's DOS-based personal computer that had an awesome dot matrix printer we used to make posters and banners. Story 6. My first personal computer game was an old game known as Cyberstrike 2. It took me 6 hours to download that 25-megabyte game. Story 7. Bedlam on the Tandy Radio Shack 80. Before that, we had a console that played Pong on the TV. Only Pong, that was all it did, no other games. Story 8. Probably a typing game in school. On a home computer, I think it was most likely Space Cadet Pinball. Story 9. Battlefield Bad Company 2. When I was 4, thanks Dad. He used to let me sit on his lap and play. I would just rack up tons of team kills and get him booted from servers. Story 10. Not exactly sure, but Donkey Kong was one of them on an Atari. It was on a cassette that took 20 years to load. Story 11. The first real game was Conan Hall of Volta. It blew my mind. I have been chasing that feeling ever since. Story 12. On a computer I owned, Pac-Man on an Atari 400. Probably at school, Number Munchers or Operation Frog. Story 13. No one else remembers it, I swear. It was not even a full game but a gimmick on version 3.1 and was called Bart's Eyes. You could move the mouse cursor and Bart Simpson would track it with his eyes. Apart from that, probably Minesweeper. The first real personal computer game was probably Hocus or Jill of the Jungle. Story 14. Back in the mid-1980s, there was a game where you steered a block or boat down a winding river. You had to write the code and record it onto a cassette tape in order to play it. I believe the system was a Radio Shack Tandy computer. Story 15. I cannot tell you for sure what came first. I played Word Munchers, Number Munchers, Oregon Trail, various Carmen Sandiego games, Tapper, Commander Keen, and Winnie the Pooh in the 100-Acre Wood in elementary school, so it was one of those. I did not get my own personal computer until I was in 8th grade, and the very first game I played on it was Star Trek 25th Anniversary. Story 16. It was for sure Pong. My Nana had a Pong console, and we would play it when we visited her. I guess it was a console and not a computer, so it could still be what I suggested above. I know we had the tape reader for the Commodore 64 and some game on there, but I don't think I ever really played it. Story 17. Math Circus and that rabbit math game. First time going to grade 1 and using a computer. That was my jam. Story 18. A text-based game where you type in the angle of your cannon, and then it prints out whether your cannonball landed in a tank of water or splattered. Story 19. Age of Empires or Warcraft 3 editor. I forget which. I was 3 years old. My dad used games to babysit me. Story 20. I had an Apple IIE in the early 1980s with a version of Snake called Snakebite. It was extremely unforgiving in hindsight, but it was all I knew. Story 21. Battle chess on my grandpa's Apple II. My family thought I was going to be some sort of prodigy because I learned how to play chess when I was 3 years old. No, it was because the cool video game I played would have the pieces turn into actual knights and bishops that had little fights when you took a square. I thought that was so cool that I wanted to see every possible combination I could, and that required being able to play chess. Story 22. Colossal Cave Adventure. A text-based game on my boss's home computer when I used to dog sit there. XYZZY and Pluff were magic words. Story 23. I played text-based Dungeons & Dragons on a work PDP-11 computer, tall as a 3-drawer filing cabinet. It was originally bought for a research and development project on a robot cell I was working on. I spent hours on that machine. You Are in a Maze will haunt me forever. Story 24. On PC, Zork was popular, but Starflight and MechWarrior were early notable games. Before that, there was the Commodore 64 and Autoduel in 1985. Story 25. Math Blaster is a kid's game for learning mathematics featuring a green alien and a robotic pet named Fido. I loved it so much. Story 26. Lionel Train Town. Some mornings after the other children went to school, my mother would sit down with me and do that for a little while. Crazy fun times. Story 27. I got a free copy of Doom in the mail. It's been so long I do not know if it was a trial or the full game, but I played it a lot. Story 28. It was a text-based flying game where you had to enter coordinates. Once in a while, you would get a brief 3-second animation of the view from your cockpit. This was around 1990, and I am sure the game was older than that. Story 29. I do not remember, but I know it was a Flash game. I also really like tanks. Maybe that was the first game I played. Story 30. Number Munchers on Apple II. Then Oregon Trail and Amazon Trail and the Island of DR. Quandary. I think the first non-educational game I played was Seventh Guest. Story 31. One of these. Digger, Dig Dug, Paratrooper. I'm also thinking Karateka, but that can't be right since that would have been a colored monitor already. Story 32. A very difficult puzzle adventure game called The Black Cauldron. Mom brought home a computer for work, and she wanted to get a computer game for me to play on it. We decided on The Black Cauldron in part because it was one of the few games on the shelf that was still compatible with a monochrome monitor, which is what we had. Shortly after, one of her coworkers gave me a disc loaded with several small games on it, including Pac-Man, Zaxxon, Alley Cat, Paratrooper, and Rogue. The mini-games in Alley Cat did not work, but the Alley part did. Story 33. It was a Hercules game and 3 cartoon characters who looked like mice. I cannot recall the name. Story 34. One of those free CD games that came with Windows installation disks. It was a side-scrolling platform game about a postman trying to deliver mail with many obstacles. Story 35. Broken Sword. Then Broken Sword 2. Then Grim Fandango, but it became too frustrating because you could progress, but then you would get stuck if you missed something. You also could not go back, and it was too early in the internet era to get walkthroughs easily. Story 36. One of the original Oregon Trail games. I swear Timmy got bitten by a snake and died before I could get going every time. Story 37. I played a very primitive Star Trek game on an automatic speech recognition teletype terminal with paper output connected to a Control Data Corporation 6400 mainframe at the University of Colorado around 1975. After that, probably Space Invaders on an Apple II in 1978. I never got into the modern games, but my wife can probably beat you in Lord of the Rings. Story 38. I remember my dad sitting me on his lap at his old green screen monochrome IBM computer and playing a game called Donkey. In the game, a donkey is on a 2-lane road, and cars come from the top of the screen toward the donkey at the bottom. You press the spacebar to make the donkey switch lanes and avoid collision. I was about 4 years old. This was the first game I ever played. Story 39. Oregon Trail in school. But the first home computer game was Zork. The first game with graphics was BC's Quest for Tires. Story 40. Probably Pong or something like that. One of those controllers had just one dial and was used for different games like tennis or hockey, which was tennis but with 2 lines of defense, or squash, or a kind of Arkanoid game. Spoiled for choice. Story 41. Number Munchers on an Apple II in elementary school, as I recall. We are going back about 40 years or so. Story 42. On a personal computer, it was Death Track. It ran on an IBM 80286 processor with a Hercules graphics card. On an 8-bit machine, the Commodore 64, it was Giana Sisters, a Mario Brothers clone, or Flimbo's Quest. I can't remember which. Story 43. My nursery had a computer. There was only one program or game that kids could play. It was a collection of mini-games where a number from 1 to 9 was pressed, and depending on the game, something would happen, such as adding a color or changing a shape. The nursery had some laminated slips they would put above the numbers on the top of the keyboard for each game to help us press the right button. It was a very basic educational game, but I have no idea what it was called. Story 44. No idea what it was called, but there were 5 levels. You played a stickman who had to jump over obstacles using a rocket pack. Story 45. It was either Summer Games or Mission Impossible. I'm not sure if that is the real name, on my friend's Commodore 64. On Mission Impossible, I remember at some point in the game it would say, "Stay a while, stay forever." I also remember playing a game called Beachhead. I loved that one. Story 46. I got started late. I think my first PC game was XCOM, UFO Defense. After that, there was a game you don't hear much about. The game played you. You interacted with it through emails, phone calls, and instant messaging. You had to sign waivers. It was called Majestic. Story 47. Whatever that strange farming game was where you learn the alphabet, math, and other subjects from around 2001. My memory of it is very vague. Story 48. Wolfenstein 3D led directly to my career. My dad brought home a computer that his workplace had let him take when they got new ones. It was a 286, and some industrious employee, who may or may not have been my dad, I never asked, had the shareware copy of Wolfenstein 3D on it. It was DOS, of course, and my dad showed 4th grader me how to play. I had a Sega Genesis at the time, I believe. I was amazed by the 3D gameplay. It quickly became my favorite game, and I made my dad teach me the DOS commands so I could boot up the computer and play it myself. Eventually, I saved up some money and managed to buy the full copy of the game. I don't remember if I had to send off for it via mail order or if it was in a retail box nearby, but either way, I got it. Most importantly, it came with the shareware copy of Doom on floppy disk. Doom would not run on our computer because it required a 386, which we didn't have, so once I knew what it was, I begged my dad to upgrade. He agreed, and we got a 486 with 4 megabytes of RAM. The 486 was great, and 4 megabytes was the minimum amount of RAM that Doom required. This new computer also had Windows. People with long memories might remember that if you booted into Windows and then exited to DOS, certain parts stayed resident in memory. There wasn't enough free conventional memory to play Doom if you booted into Windows first. So my dad and I figured out how to press F8 and do an interactive startup, skipping Windows and some other non-essentials. Suddenly, I could play Doom's demo. It was revelatory. I eventually bought Doom and then Doom 2. By the time I got Doom 2, Quake had come out, and our 486 couldn't play Quake. So I begged my dad to upgrade, but he said no. I mowed countless yards and worked in my aunt's snow cone stand to save nearly $1,000 and ordered my very first set of computer components to build my own PC from the back of catalogs. I got all the parts in, not knowing what I was doing, and assembled it in the kitchen. I pressed the power button, and nothing happened. It turned out the cheap case from the catalog didn't come with motherboard standoffs, and I didn't know they existed. I mounted the motherboard directly to the steel case, which shorted it out, and it instantly died. When the computer wouldn't work, we took it to a local PC repair shop. They told me what I had done wrong. I was upset, but my dad took pity on me and funded the repair. The local shop let me watch as they properly assembled the computer once the replacement parts came in. They showed me several things I had done wrong and became my go-to place for computer parts rather than mail order. A little later, when I was 15, I got a job at the local computer shop. I learned a lot and installed Windows 98 so many times I can still remember the CD key we always used. I could keep going with the story, but suffice to say that job led to another, which became my career. All thanks to Wolfenstein 3D. Story 49. A game called Sabotage on the Apple II. Though mine was definitely not in color, but rather greenscale. Story 50. I remember an ancient game with Atari-style graphics where you collected different colored keys or the rooms were different colors. Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego is probably the first I can name. Story 51. Hot Wheels Stunt Track Driver. I was 3 years old at the time. I re-downloaded it a few weeks ago, and I am surprised by how difficult it is, at least compared to when I was young. Story 52. Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of Lounge Lizards. The Probably Oregon Trail. Laugh Out Loud. That spent the most time in LORD. Story 53. Discounting the old hearts and space pinball game that used to be pre-installed. The first actual computer game I remember playing was the first Lego Island on my dad's old work IBM ThinkPad. This was before I knew computers could be used for fun. I saw it on the cheap sale rack at the end of the games section in what was then Safeway and begged my mum for it because I liked Lego. It might not be the first, but it's the first I specifically remember playing on a personal computer. Story 54. Not including the Commodore 64 because I honestly cannot remember any of the names of the games. I was like 4 or 5, and discounting consoles, I think it was Granny's Garden on a computer at school. The first game on a computer outside of school was CivNet on a friend's Intel 122. If you played it with a music CD instead of a game CD, it would use random songs for the Civilization's anthems. We always included Roy Wood and Wizard. Story 55. The actual first game was Granny's Garden, or one of those text-based DOS PC type games around 1990. The first game I played that was recognizable as what we think of as games nowadays was probably Quake. Story 56. Worms or Counter-Strike 1.6 or the Hercules game, if somebody knows it. My brother is 8 years older than me, so I already played Counter-Strike when I was around 7 or 8 years old. Story 57. Probably Warcraft or Worms. Or an obscure disk operating system game no one else seems to remember called Horrors.exe. You gave an invisible man cigarettes. There was a werewolf and a vampire too. Very vague memories of it. Story 58. Either Oregon Trail or this similar game where you delivered goods across the country. Every week we had a computer day, and we had to switch between the two games so the same person could not hog Oregon Trail every week. Story 59. Probably Oregon Trail or Ski Free, but it could also have been Command and Conquer Red Alert, or maybe Myst. Or maybe Doom, Star Wars X-Wing, or one of the King's Quest games. I was so young that it is hard to remember. I just know my older cousins had all these games and would let me play them when I visited as a kid. Story 60. I want to say something like Math Blaster, Laser Chess, Zork, Chuck Yeager's Air Combat, but my first was probably Pong. Story 61. GTA Vice City at a computer shop, and when I got my first personal computer, I completed and played the hell out of it. Then I got Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. Story 62. Battle Chess, Operation Wolf, and the text adventure with the Blue Ox were on 5 1/4-inch floppy disks. Yes, I am old. Story 63. Wizard 101 was exciting when Celestia was first released. Still has a great atmosphere. I check in from time to time, and with the frequent updates to the game, I believe it is worth every penny. Story 64. My name is Sam Daniels. I was born in the year 1980 on the 4th of July. Next time you want to determine someone's age, just ask for it rather than posting these bizarre artificial intelligence information phishing posts. Thank you. Story 65. Gertrude's Secrets, 1984. Our elementary school had one computer, so they would take turns wheeling it to different classrooms. I hated that pixelated goose. Runners-up include The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy text adventure game. It was funny, but I found it very frustrating. Also, Marble Madness several years before it was ported to Nintendo. Also, the Skyfox Flight Simulator game. Good memories. Story 66. When I was little, my uncle was in a computer engineering program. He would bring home all sorts of small games that people had created. Some were just running through cubicles, running from aliens. They would be on large floppy disks or even on cassette tapes. Story 67. Eurofighter EF 2000, won Computer Gaming World's 1995 Simulation of the Year. It was a multiplayer game. I still remember some of the people I played with. It was loaded with DOS, and using a modem with a speed of just 56 kilobits per second was challenging. When the 3,300 kilobits per second modems came out, it was a game changer. Story 68. It's a bit hard to remember, but I think it was either Oregon Trail on the Apple II or Gradius on the Commodore 128. Story 69. Depending on your definition of a computer, it was either Jumpman on a Commodore 64 or Combat on an Atari 2600. Story 70. I had a computer system when I was a kid, but I don't recall the name. It didn't come with games or programs of any kind. You had to type many lines to build the game yourself. I had lots of books with games that provided the codes. All the game characters and environments were made of arranged letters and numbers that formed shapes. The only game I remember playing a lot featured snowmen. Story 71. I know there were others before it, but the first I remember was Doom. I do not know what it says about my father letting a 4-year-old play Doom in 1994, but I was playing Doom. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.